So today we come back to what I had intended to do and had been doing with a few more lectures, that is introducing you to authors and social theorists outside the canon. As I stated earlier, one of the intents in this course that I have is to look at the voices that did not make it into the canon and yet are very significant in how we understand the theory and practice of sociology. So in today's lecture, we'll be talking primarily about two authors, Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Pandita Ramabai. There is another shift that I'm going to do today, and that is we're going to start today's lecture with a story. And here once again, I want to introduce different ways through which a critique of society can happen. It doesn't just need to be in one prescribed format. And the two authors that I've picked, one of them is also writing fiction. There is some other fiction also that I will introduce very briefly in this lecture. But the idea being that along with Charlotte Perkins Gilman writing very major works of a sociological analysis, she's also exploring other ways to make the point that how patriarchy and women's exclusion actually constructs a particular kind of society and the harms of it. So in this particular story, which came under a lot of critique at its time, it was published in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and shocked a lot of people. And in fact, one doctor is said to have remarked that it should never have been published because it would make anybody who reads it go mad. Another one actually commented that this is a description of insanity, incipient insanity. And you will know, once I narrate the story, you will get a better sense of what I'm talking about. But what Charlotte Perkins Gilman is trying to do is show what confining women to the private sphere, to limiting their intellectual and creative pursuits, to keeping them away from autonomous activity, and also how a world constructed through a male worldview actually impacts women's life. So let's go straight into the story, and I'll very briefly relate it, but there are several, it's a short story, you can read it. It's available freely on the internet, but I've also put up a link for how it was converted into a film and you can watch it. And it's being read aloud with visualization, so you might enjoy listening to it. But the story starts off with the narrator, an unnamed woman who has just given birth to a baby and is going through what we now know as postpartum depression. At that time, this was called hysteria, coming from the Latin word for uterus, where it was seen as the limitation of a woman's reproductive system and was specially seen as affecting those who tried to go beyond the limits of their intellectual boundaries, the prescribed intellectual boundaries or creative boundaries. So this narrator is experiencing symptoms of depression and is prescribed what is called as the rest cure. Now this part of the story is semi-autobiographical because Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was a sociologist, who was a social reformer, a fiction writer, also a poet and an activist in the women's suffrage movement, was herself subjected to this rest cure prescribed by one Dr. Weir Mitchell, who was at that time considered one of the top physicians and prescribes for hysteria something called the rest cure, and which limits her to her room. Like the husband in the story is also a doctor, and he basically puts her in this room which has a yellow wallpaper, which is the title of the story, and she has been asked to limit intellectual activity, limit social interaction, not take hold of pen, brush or pencil in her life, and really just focus on a domestic role. In the story, she is put into that room which is locked from the outside, and she starts seeing figures and hearing voices from this yellow paper, which she's subjected to viewing the whole day and whole night. And eventually, I will not go into too much detail, at the end of the story, she starts seeing herself in that wallpaper, tears the wallpaper around, and goes insane, but also, as some have argued, finds her inner voice in that process. There are several devices that Charlotte Perkins Gilman uses in this narrative. One is it's a first person narrative where the author is narrating the story as what is going on in her mind. So oftentimes she says that I feel like doing this, but John is her husband who is also a doctor, but John says that this is not good for me, so I should do this. And he knows and he loves me and he is best for me, and therefore I should listen to him. So this is a device that the author uses in narrating the tale. And let's get into some of the key social theoretical themes that this story, Yellow Wallpaper, raises for us. So firstly, I do want to situate very strongly the novel as a form of social critique and fiction itself as social theory. If you remember, we spoke very briefly about Harriet Martineau and how she wrote illustrations to political economy in very short novellas, where she took up several themes from political economy and wrote them in a fictional manner, but then to get the critique of political economy across to a much wider audience. This is a very significant strategy of its time, but also as of now we would consider it a very strong feminist strategy to take knowledge beyond the confines of the academy, to make it accessible to a wider audience, and for them to be in a way that for them to be able to engage in a debate around it. So that is one of the ideas that I think the Yellow Wallpaper very nicely conveys. It's a social critique, it's a critique of a certain epistemic form of knowledge, and done in the form, in a very creative form of a short story, right? There's a lot more about the story that we can go about, but since this is a class in social theory, we'll remain to its sociological insights. The story very clearly critiques patriarchy, but it doesn't just critique patriarchy as the relationship between a husband and a wife within the home. It critiques larger patriarchal structures as what we would now call, with an understanding of epistemic domination of knowledge generated by men in the field of medicine and the sciences. So this doctor, who in actually reality had prescribed the rest cure to Charlotte Perkins Gilman, was a highly reputed medical professional, right? And the scientific knowledge of the time which she critiques in her later work, was constructed in the context of male domination and therefore mirrored that sensibility. It was not drawn from a woman's world, or did not have that kind of sensitivity to women's experiences, and in fact a lot of that knowledge showed women's experiences as irrational or irrelevant and in need of control and guidance from the men. So there is that critique that happens through the story Yellow Wallpaper. Also, there is a notion of the home as this paradise space, as a space that is a safe space, as a loving space for the woman of the house. But she, through her story, really challenges that. She is trapped in that one room by her very loving husband, and so through the story she shows the home as a carceral space. She also shows how the suppression of women's intellectual and creative work is in fact alienating them from what is the core of their subjecthood, and creating what could be called a double consciousness, in the sense, remember that in interaction between John, her husband, her doctor husband, and the narrator that I spoke about, where she's unable to make sense of whether her feelings are real or what her husband is prescribing for her is the real thing. In fact, towards the beginning of the story, she's always, but John is right. But, whatever I'm thinking is not quite my experience or not quite the right thing to feel. So she is downplaying her own understanding of herself and in fact taking her husband's understanding of herself as the real one. This could in some ways be seen as what Du Bois had called double consciousness. He spoke about it in the context of race, and here we see it in the context of gender in the story, The Yellow Wallpaper. The short story is very strongly a critique of marriage, especially of bourgeois marriage, where a woman's confinement to her home, she might be surrounded with very pretty, expensive things, but is subjected to domesticity and in fact not allowed to engage in her own creative pursuits. And through the narrative, she shows how the rest cure itself produces the insanity that it purported to cure. And so that whole discourse in fact ends up creating the insanity in the story, and the story then shows us how madness is socially produced and because of the discourse that defines it. So these were some of the themes in Yellow Wallpaper, but Charlotte Perkins Gilman did not just write the story or poems. She wrote very strong sociological books, well researched on the conditions of marriage, of women and the economy, on understanding of the home and the relationship between men and women, and several other stories. So let us just again look at the timeline, and by now you have a good sense of what is happening around this time from the late 1800s up until the 1930s or so. We spoke about it in various lectures in terms of what is going on in the world. So in today's lecture, I've largely focused on what were some of women's what were the women writing in this time period, which we know now as the moment where sociology as a discipline emerges in the world. So as early as 1887, in the 1800s, late 1800s, we see Pandita Ramabai, who is a social reformer, an author and an activist, born in Maharashtra, India, to an upper caste Brahmin family, writing what in Marathi, a text called Stri Dharma Niti, where she challenges child marriage and the rituals associated with widowhood in her text. She herself was married very young and was widowed young, but was educated in Sanskrit and the texts by her father, and she spends her life basically promoting women's education and writing about the condition of upper caste Hindu women in India. In 1887, while traveling in the United States, Pandita Ramabai publishes The High Caste Hindu Woman, the first detailed description of upper caste Hindu women and the rituals of widowhood, the problems of child marriage and religious sanctions that keep the oppression of women in place in the Indian society at the time. Around the same time, Charlotte Perkins Gilman publishes The Yellow Wallpaper. We just spoke about it. And Ida Wells, I did not mention her, or perhaps I did when I was speaking about Du Bois, but she's active around the same time as Du Bois is writing and is herself a very vocal activist around questions of race in the American context. So one of her texts is on lynch law in its phases. And then in 1895, she writes The Red Record, which is basically tabulated statistics and the alleged causes of lynching in the United States. A very strong critique of lynching and of the conditions of African Americans at the time in the United States. 1898, Charlotte Perkins Gilman publishes Women and Economics. And then in 1903, she writes Home, Its Work and Influence. Next year, a book called Human Work. And now in 1905, I've positioned Rokeya Sakhyawat Hussain and her fictional writing on a book called Sultana's Dream. It's a science fiction book, and I will end today's lecture with a narration of that story. But this can perhaps be considered as one of the first science fiction English texts written in the world. It's a feminist story, very much. You will see when I narrate it at the end of the lecture. Then 1911, Charlotte Perkins Gilman writes The Man-Made World, where she is talking about how the ideas of the world all come from a male point of view and therefore are restrictive. Then she publishes another story, Herland, in some ways similar to Hussein's Sultana's Dream, because both of them are about a world which is centered around women. And then she follows with a sequel where the characters go from her land, this world centered around women, come back to our land. And then, so through this fictional narrative, they are, talking about the way gender relations are structured in both these societies. Both Herland and With Her in Our Land, she wrote as a series of different shorter narratives and then combined them into the form of a novel. There were several other texts that I'm missing out in this, but these were largely the books that I want to speak about in today's class. I mean, not all of them, some of them, but also to give you a sense of what women are writing in the United States, Harriet Martineau in Europe, although also about the United States, and in India, since this lecture is for the Indian context. So, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, we just spoke about all the several books that she wrote, and then now I want to come to some of the themes that she raises in these books. In Women in Economics, her primary argument is that of economic dependence. For her, the main cause of women's oppression is her dependence on men for economy, for money. She writes, although women's work in the household is essential, is necessary to the survival of the world, it is not valued, it is not paid, and that women's work needs to be valued and that they should be allowed to participate in the world of economy. Then she conceptualizes marriage as not something based primarily on affection or love, as the ideas of the time tried to show, but that it is a sex-economic relation. It's an economic relation between the two sexes. I'll read out some of the quotes from her. She writes, it is not sex that is at the bottom of women's wrongs, but the sex-economic relation. At another time, she critiques the idea that, women's brains are not as strong or not as powerful, not as intelligent, arguing that the brain is not a sex organ. Talking about the female brain is like talking about a female liver. So she really challenges this notion of women's not being able to or not allowed to do the things that they are capable of by all of these arguments that are floating around in terms of that she's weak, that she's not, that she should not pursue intellectual pursuits because that is harmful to the woman's body and so on, that her brain is structured differently. She is challenging all of that. She writes, our marriage system has grown up under the impulse of property, not of affection. Here you can see insights of what Frederick Engels wrote in Family, Private Property and the State. She's also identifying property at the center of domestic relations and the oppression of women. In her book, The Home, Its Work and Influence, she writes, the home is not a primitive thing in human life, but a late product of civilization. So she shows the idea of the home that we have is a social construction that emerges from certain historical processes. The women's role inside the house is not something that is given. It is something that is socially constructed. The home, as we know it, is the woman's workshop, where she works alone. The world's work should be done by the world and not by each woman in her own kitchen. She argues for a lot of care work to become socialized, such that things like domestic work, things like childcare, things like cooking, for it to be made more communal, so that women also have the possibility of exploring their creative and intellectual life. Then in the man-made world, she presents the very important insight that the world, because it was largely the men who occupied the public sphere, the laws, the institutions, the science, the medicine, the texts have all been written by men, and therefore the discourse that surrounds us is a masculine discourse. Then she makes the leap to say that we have accepted that masculine discourse as the universal, as the norm, as the right one, as the right way to think, as the normal view. She writes, in the man-made world or our androcentric culture, we have accepted the masculine view of life as the normal view. So very, very important ideas from the social relation of gender perspective. I do want to take a brief moment to talk about the critique of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So while she was very evocatively giving us a woman's point of view of her times, it was very much a white, upper class, bourgeois woman point of view that we get to see in Gilman's work. In fact, many of her writings show that she believed in eugenics. She does not at all speak about race relations. She does not challenge colonialism. So all the other forms of oppression and hierarchy, she is either blind to or condones. And this is a solid critique of Gilman as a sociologist, but from a gendered point of view. So then not so much a feminist point of view, because we would see feminist scholarship as something that unsettles power relations across the board, not just gendered social relations. So while she is focusing on upper class, white women, gendered social relations, she is, oblivious to or is actually justifying some of the other hierarchies in the world that she inhabits. Let us now come to Pandita Ramabai Saraswati. Pandita Ramabai Saraswati was born in Maharashtra to a Brahmin family, and her father went against the norm of the time to educate his daughter in the scriptures and in Sanskrit. For the knowledge that she had, she also received an honorary doctorate, very rare for her time. She publishes several books. The one that I have up here is The High Caste Hindu Woman, published in 1905 while she was in the United States, so it's in English. Let us go through very quickly some of the key theoretical insights that she shows in her book. What we see here is not just a critique of patriarchy, but she talks about the life cycle patriarchy. So she talks about how when a girl is born, she's under the control of her father. Then when she marries, she's under the control of her husband, and after her husband passes away, she's under the control of the son. So patriarchy, at no point, even when she's the elder woman in the house, is there a possibility of escaping the patriarchy that structures her life. At all points, there is a male control, and patriarchy follows her through her life cycle. So very important insight that she presents in this text. She links religion and caste to the oppression of women. So while, for example, Gilman is linking economic dependence, which also Ramabai does, but economic dependence is largely the reason for women's oppression, Pandita Ramabai shows us that women's oppression or their lower status in society is religiously sanctioned and defined by the rules of particular castes. So it's defined differently for higher caste women and would be different for lower caste women, or different castes of women would experience it differently based on the rules of the caste and the rules of how different castes can or cannot relate to each other. Then from her own experience, and looking at other widows, she likens widowhood to social death, right? especially under Brahmanical patriarchy. She shows how the rituals that remove women from society, that kind of lock her into particular customs in terms of what she can eat, what she can wear, who she can engage with, or when she can talk to another person, all of them really confine her in a very, very limited space, such that she's pretty much removed from the functionings of society and isolated, which then Ramabai calls as social death. Patriarchy is enforced through caste structures. I already spoke about that. Economic dependence, also she speaks about. Lack of education. She says the only way for women to escape these structures is by educating themselves, and she herself does a lot in that, and by establishing institutions for the education of girls, by establishing institutions that take care of the educational, the material and the occupational needs of widows, especially child widows in upper caste Hindu society of her times. And she argues against the religious sanctions that keep women in the place where it is not possible for them, or very difficult for them, to grow as individuals, as autonomous beings. She herself, at a particular point in her life, converts to Christianity because she sees that as somehow more open to women's education and women's access to a life outside the confines of the home. This is my last slide, and here again I want to come back to fiction by putting up in front of you two fictional narratives. The first one is Rokia Hussein's Sultana Dream and Herland. In both of these novels, you see the establishment of an alternative world, the establishment of a woman's world where women kind of take the calls. In Sultana's Dream, in fact, it is the women who are running the world and the men are shifted to Zenana, or the private sphere. They call it Mardana in that story. But she describes a beautiful world. She describes how, for example, gardens are everywhere. Kitchen is situated right in the garden. It is open and airy. There is a lot of sunlight. There are no fumes, as was the condition of the times when women would cook with wood fire, or like there was a lot of smoke in the kitchen. In this case, it's a sci-fi. The women are cooking with solar energy. The women in the novel have harnessed water from the clouds by putting up a balloon in above the clouds, and so water is freely available and goes into the households straight from the atmosphere. She talks about wind energy. Primarily, the book shows how society could be reimagined in harmony with nature and in harmony with each other. Care is central. There are no wars. There is no crime, so you don't need a police, you don't need a magistrate, and it's a very interesting story. I don't want to go into all of it in detail, but I really encourage you to actually watch this illustrated version of it. I've given the YouTube link over here. It's also published in an illustrated form, so you might enjoy reading that. In fact, the YouTube link is of the illustrator to the illustrated volume brought out by Tara Books. So you might, I think you would enjoy it. The other one, Herland, is also about the woman's world where women live together and in harmony and care, without dominance and without what is often seen as masculine traits of aggression and overt ambition and so on. While these are imagining utopian alternative worlds, they are giving an insight also into perhaps how the world might be structured differently and what possibilities could it open up. So please go ahead and read them, and I will end this lecture here. See you in the next lecture. Bye.